All right, well, let's get this party going again here on the main stage. Our next speaker is a pioneer in the voice space. If you haven't visited voicebot.ai or listened to the podcast, he is doing so much in this space and doing a lot of interesting research. And this next talk about the platform wars, I mean, let's admit it, there is an all-out battle going on for supremacy. We know it. We're watching it unfold before our eyes. And our next speaker is very close to what's happening. So let's give it up for Mr. Bret Kinsella. Come on up, Bret. Thank you, sir. Great to see you.
All right. Thanks for coming out today. You know, I was thinking about it. When I would speak at an event like this a year ago, there would maybe be 100 people at the entire conference, not just like in a breakout session. I mean, we have breakout sessions in some of the smaller rooms that are getting 100 people in it. And then I think about, I spoke at an event in Paris in February, and they had to double the venue size like 2 weeks before the event because it was oversold. And that was only 250 people. They probably could have accommodated 350. And then I really give it to Pete for being a visionary in the space and saying, hey, the industry could support something much larger. And 1,500 people, not 150 people. And it turns out it's probably 3,000, right? So it exceeds people's expectations. And the reason we're here is because voice is moving fast, right? That's the one thing that we understand. And we also know through experience that the competition is fierce. So the question is, why are the biggest tech companies in the world, in the US and China and elsewhere, so focused on this space? Why are giant telecom companies in Europe building their own voice assistants? That's what we're going to talk about today. What I want to do is I want to talk to you about why people care about this, what their motivations are, what the assets are of some of the different leading players, and how that can inform the strategy going forward. Some of you in this room might be attempting to build a voice assistant, and so understanding the strategic landscape will be essential for you. Some of you might just be trying to work within these platforms, and hopefully some of the things we talk about today will give you insight into which ones may be best aligned with you and the future you want to go forward with. So the first thing I want to just mention, or I want to find out, is how many people here are familiar with voicebot.ai? Okay, so that's pretty good. I'd say maybe 60% of the room. Not nearly enough. So great Wi-Fi here. You all have phones. You can look up voicebot.ai and you should check it out. So what we do is we do research, news. We have a podcast. It's really popular. We've been doing some additional interviews upstairs. What we are is we're the central repository for the voice industry. So we have data, we have research, opinion, news, everything that you would need. So if you want to follow this space, I recommend you check it out. And do so today, please. Okay, so here's what we're talking about. Voice Platform Wars is a battle for adoption, attention, authority, and agency. Do you see what I did there? I made 4 A's, okay? So you guys could follow along. And that's really the key thing that we want to talk about. And I really bring this thing up. I presume most people are familiar with this? Okay. What does it mean when a new technology shows up on South Park? What does it mean when it shows up on The Tonight Show or in a sitcom? It means it's pervasive enough that the awareness is high enough that you can actually put it into one of these popular culture settings and people understand the joke, right? And so that's important. And it's just an indicator of how fast things are moving. And I do recommend you check this out. We're not going to do video today because we don't have enough time, but this is, how many people have heard of Google Duplex? Haha, more people know voicebot.ai than Google Duplex. Now that is a surprise. So you should check that out. But this idea that an assistant can work on behalf of you as if you're a canine, and it can interact in the world. And so this is this whole idea of what we're heading towards. Okay, so I want to talk about the battlefield really quickly. But before that, let's talk about what's happening in the different fields of competition. So the first we're going to talk about is smart speakers. So this is Activate Forecast. I work with a lot of different analysts doing great work. This is one of the more interesting ones, which looked at some of the most pervasive technologies of our time. And they said, what is the adoption rate? How quickly are they moving towards 50%? And smart speakers are actually moving faster than the fastest previous technology, which was the smartphone. People are saying, is it as good as the iPhone? It's actually faster. And so from a device landscape standpoint, this is important. If there's marketers in here, you're going to be thinking about, well, how many consumers does it reach? Because that's what marketers think about, reach and frequency. Well, it actually just passed 50 million. A national consumer survey that VoiceBot did with Voices found that over 50 million people in the US now have access to a smart speaker. And that's up about 20%, or that's up almost 20% from just earlier at the beginning of this year. But it's really not just a US phenomenon, it's also a global phenomenon, and that's important to understand. Canalys put this data out. They're looking at 100 million worldwide by the end of this year. Will probably be about 2/3 US, 1/3 rest of the world. Rest of the world is going to take over. US was only 45% of all smart speaker shipments in the first quarter of this year. It's the first time that that's happened since the technology has come out. So this is moving globally really quickly. They've got some other great stuff. There's an article on this analyzing their data on voicebot.ai, so you can check that out. It shows Amazon and Google, essentially establishing a duopoly. Whether that comes to pass or not, we can talk about as we go through the presentation today. But it's not just smart speakers. So mobile's going to really accelerate the growth. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But 500 million devices now have access to Google Assistant. Over 500 million Apple devices also have access, but probably more importantly is almost 400 million who are using Siri on a monthly basis. So whatever you think about Siri, great or not, it was the first technology that most people saw that introduced them to voice assistants. And there's a lot of people who are using it. They're using it narrowly. They're not using it for a lot of utility, but they're using it. And really what's happening is voice is becoming pervasive. Smart speakers, phones, it's going into everything. And we see this, and there's other speakers here. We'll talk about it being in appliances and headphones and other type of displays, televisions, watches. And really what's going to be happening is microphones are soon going to be everywhere. The question is, what's behind the mic? And that is what the big voice platforms care about. All the voice assistant players want to be that voice behind the mic. They want to be at least one of the voices behind the mic, and they hope to be the primary or maybe even the sole voice behind the mic. Okay, so let's talk about adoption. We're going to talk about smart speakers. I want to come back to smart speakers because they're the vanguard of voice adoption right now globally. And they are not idle. They are used frequently. So if we just look at this chart over here, what you can see is that almost 90% of the people who own a smart speaker use it at least monthly. Okay? So we're familiar with those monthly active users, daily, weekly active users. Well, look at this. So 90% at least monthly, 2/3 at least daily, and 1/3 multiple times a day. Okay? So these are the types of things that are not novelties, they're not paperweights. When they get into the home, they're being used frequently. And they're gateway drugs. So smart speakers are the gateway drugs to voice. Okay, so this is a study that just came out this month from Edison Research and NPR, and they asked them a bunch of questions. But buried in the back of this study is this slide. And this slide is very telling. Now, I will tell you that they talk about early adopters and the early mainstream and how we've crossed the chasm and all that. Don't worry about that for a second. Just look at these numbers. People who buy a smart speaker, 3/5 of them recommend to their friends to buy one. They didn't want to go back to life before it. Now, if that's not an addict, I don't know what is, right? So they bring these in, they use them frequently, they know or they believe their life is better after they get it. So this is something that's important about smart speakers, but voice in particular, is that it looks like it has staying power. It's going to be sticky, right? It's not going to be something that's just going to get usurped in the next tech adoption cycle. Okay, the last thing then is what I want to focus on. Since getting a smart speaker, you are using the voice-operated assistant on your smartphone more. Okay? So over half of the people, so on a weighted average, over half the people are putting a smartphone, or a smart speaker into their home, and then they're starting to say, oh, I have voice on my mobile phone too, and I'm going to, why am I not using that more? And so they start doing that. VoiceBot did another study where we were able to correlate clearly, and there's a report on our site, which I recommend you look at. It's called the Voice Commerce Report. And we were able to show that people with smart speakers over-index significantly, 2 to 3x, in terms of use of voice on smartphones. So there's a correlation there because it's a training ground. There we go. All right. And this is the training that's going on. So a couple of different things. So first of all, they're interacting with the device. And once you interact with the device and you get comfortable asking for things with voice, you then start to think, well, can I use it somewhere else? But there's another thing that's going out. I mean, how many people in this room have used a smart speaker with someone else in the room? Everyone. That's actually, I wish the number of VoiceBot readers was as high as that. All right, so what that means is a couple of things. One is not only are you training yourself to use voice, but you are actually training other people. And what you find in a lot of households is there are technology early adopters and there are technology laggards. Well, the technology laggards are actually learning from the early adopters in the home, and they're starting to incorporate it into their daily practices. So what happens then is you go from talking to the smart speaker to talking to the voice assistant on the phone. And now this is one way to do it. My friend Brian Romilly, some of you may know, calls this pizza phone, because you can imagine someone photoshopping a slice of pizza where the phone is. A much more sophisticated way to do this is to use AirPods or Pixel Buds or something else, Bragi. And so what we're seeing is that voice is jumping to different areas. So voice has been on the phone for a while, but now it's in your ear and always available and maybe more private. But it starts with people becoming accustomed to the idea that voice is a choice, right? That's what smart speakers have really done. And so ultimately, smart speakers are they're voice assistant awareness, affinity building, and training devices. And that's why they're important. So don't listen to the person and say, oh, it's all about the voice assistant. Smart speakers aren't important. Well, sort of, because the voice assistants are really what the big players care about, and that's what we care about. But the smart speakers are important, and what they've done is they've created this situation where not only are we training, we're using it more, but it's going to be throughout the house. And this whole idea of voice access to computing and data resources in the home, as well as on our person, okay? So Siri may have introduced the world to voice assistants, and voice assistants on smartphones may have been the first thing, may have made voice a thing. But smart speakers made it a thing that was popular and broadly used. Okay, so why does this matter so much to the tech titans? First and foremost, I think a lot of people recognize that voice is a different UI, user interface, right? And so what we like to think about in VoiceBot is this evolution. So we had the web, based on the internet, and that offered tremendous benefits to people that were never there before. It was the first way to do digital distribution in real time. And then we moved to touch on the mobile device, and that built on the web, but it gave you access to data anywhere. You still had a touch, you had a manual interaction, you had to be really focused on it. And then we get to voice, where you can speak, right? And so that could be anywhere. It could be on your phone, it could be in the building that you're in, and it's hands-free, eyes-free. Okay, so each of these is backed by a new technology platform. Right? So if we think about this, we've got the World Wide Web was enabled by the internet. Mobile really would not have succeeded in the way it has without the cloud. It was an efficient way to deliver the data at scale remotely. And voice wouldn't work without AI. And there's the AI in the front end that we're familiar with, which does the natural language processing and the intent understanding. And then eventually there will be AI in the back end, which will deliver dynamic responses based on whatever query you have, regardless of what the programmatic interface is. Okay, but what's all the fuss about? So the first thing is, what we see across all these platforms is they enable distribution of content. They create a way to generate engagement. And each of them allows you to conduct transactions, okay? So that's the same. So we've seen parity, it really is a UI type of thing. But what's different? So the first thing is we start to get to, in mobile, attention became a big thing. You really couldn't control a consumer's attention in the desktop. There were some people who tried to do it. Those of us who are a little bit older remember like Yahoo and Excite, the portals early on in the web, or AOL, right, the walled garden. They really controlled your attention, they tried to control your attention, but it was a really loose enforcement of that. On mobile, it became different because it was always with you and you'd have your screen. And so you could walk to the next room and they could still maintain your attention or give you a push notification and interrupt you to pull your attention back, right? And so that was really important. And then we have this idea of authority. And authority is the idea of funneling people to the information that you think is right. It might be the information you think is the best for them, might be the information you want them to see, right? And so we had the de facto leader of Google in each of these areas, but you did have a choice. You could always go to something else, switch off to Bing or to go direct to a website or something like that to find the information you wanted. When we get to voice, nope, you don't do that. Your interface is the assistant. You don't have alternatives. Now, eventually, maybe you will with Sonos being able to allow you to choose your assistant, but today, it's that authority is defined by the assistant, and that's really important. It's a lock-in, okay? So you think about de facto or in fact, it's in fact, okay? If we look at some of the big players, interesting how they line up around these value propositions, right? So Amazon, the king of transactions. When did Amazon start? Early days of the web, right? And they've just jumped each new technology wave and really have led in the voice space. And then we have attention. There were people who tried to get attention, right? What we said, the portals early on, but that didn't really work in the early web days. But Facebook earned this, right? Space. And guess what? In the voice space, they don't have a play right now, or at least a significant one. They've done a lot of experimentation. Do you think they're worried about that? Does that give you a sense of why they might be willing to invest billions of dollars to potentially maintain that position and not just give it up to one of their fierce competitors in the tech landscape? And Google, so they have the de facto lead in the previous 2 generations of tech, but they can have the lock. Right? And if they don't lock it in, if Amazon is there, or Microsoft, or Samsung, or anybody else, then they lost that position. And then we get to the really big one, and it's agency. Agency is when you delegate to someone or something the responsibility, authority to do something on your behalf. So it's one thing for me to ask Google for something or to ask my voice assistant to do something, but then I get a choice of whether I take that advice, I complete that transaction. But the voice assistants aren't going to stop there. We're going to delegate authority to them, right? And they're going to be doing things on our behalf. And how likely is it that when Google identifies that I've got something coming up and I might need a reservation, or I might need a new product for that they're going to funnel that purchase through Amazon.com? No, they're not going to. They're going to funnel it through Google Express. Now, maybe they'll do whatever's best for the consumer, maybe, but they're not going to go out of their way to help their competitors. And so when this gets to the point where they're making decisions for you, this is what is an potentially existential crisis for all of the players in this market. Okay, so the objective is adoption. Smart speakers are one of the tools they're using for adoption. There's other tools they're getting out there. The payoff is attention, authority, and agency. All of those have value. You can see that we showed the tech behemoths have built businesses around those concepts. Okay, so let's talk about the competitors. So the first thing to talk about, it is a bipolar world. There are the competitors in China, which are huge companies in their own right. Some of the people in here will be familiar with them, but a lot of them are not. And then there is the rest of the world. And today, the rest of the world is largely dominated by a few large tech companies in the US. There are players in Europe that are attempting to make a play in this space, but they've got a long way to go because they don't have these assets. So we don't know where the next player is going to come in this space necessarily from, but these are the ones who are the incumbents today. Okay, so tier one, Amazon. So I just want to talk a little bit about a couple things about them. So first of all, what are they trying to do? They're trying to put Alexa everywhere because when we think about it, they're the king of transactions, but now they could become the king of attention, the king of authority, all these other types of things. So that's what Alexa Everywhere really helps that. And what we talk about these ideas of the graphs. They have the commerce graph. Nobody knows more about what's bought, at least in the US and in several other markets they operate in. In China, it would be Alibaba. But nobody knows more about what's bought, what people are looking for, what the preferences are, and those types of things. They've got a lot of assets that allow them to be successful in this space. And they've got a number of products. And they have ways to make money, which is important because ultimately, even Jeff Bezos wants to make money. And product sales is a key thing. And so CIRP did a study early on that Amazon Prime members who bought an Echo spent 10% more in the year following the purchase of the Echo. That's a material difference, 10% lift. And a lot of that really enhances profitability. They also have cloud hosting fees, and for those of you who are not paying attention, they are trying to challenge Facebook and Google for advertising now. They've got a whole bunch of initiatives around that. All right, Google has the knowledge graph, so that's the number one thing that they fall back on. They are the de facto standard for search. They want to protect their mobile franchise. They're worried that some new technology shift could change that. They've got a lot of assets. Monetization, as we all know, is largely advertising. And I bring this up for a couple reasons. One is, we talked about the idea that they want to make money. But in general, all companies revert to what they know eventually because they're good at it, because they have entrenched interests in that space. It's a faster way for them to compete. And so ultimately, Google will introduce something to the advertising. It might not be the interruption advertising that we're familiar with today. It's not going to be pop-ups necessarily. It could be product placement. It could be sponsorship. It could be recommendations. It could just be all sorts of things that they have in terms of allowing people to maybe co-brand or co-market. But likely they'll be there. There'll be subscription fees. They're going to do commerce. But commerce is kind of an add-on for them long term. We'll see how Google Express does. It's doing well now, but it's a long way to compete with Amazon on that. And they have a lot of things, including the phone, including great AI assets. Let's talk about the tier two. So I'm sorry if you're from one of those other companies and you didn't make tier one, but that's just the way it is today. If we look at it, we look at use, okay? So Apple, we talk about the fanboy graph, which is sort of a tongue-in-cheek way to say they have really high affinity with their users, all right? And so interestingly enough, they don't focus on attention, authority, agency. They focus on delivering sort of the ultimate experience. And that might provide some insight in why they don't have a lot of traction in this market yet. They're thinking about it differently. Their motivations are different, right? So they've got great assets. They sell products. It looks like voice assistants will be a service-oriented business from a revenue standpoint. And so the question then is, where's the product play for a company that's used to that? We've got Facebook, the social graph. A lot of people sort of snicker. Why is Facebook doing this? Well, we just talked about it. They want to maintain attention. They want agency. They want to be able to establish their authority. They want to protect their advertising franchise. They came out of nowhere to become the #2 digital ad network in the world. And it basically is setting up a duopoly with Google. They're tier two because it's not clear what's going to happen. I mean, they're going to roll out Smart Display to compete with the Echo Show. They're going to do it outside the U.S. for a bunch of reasons. It'll be in the U.S. pretty soon. A lot of the rancor around Facebook is blown over at this point. But the fact is, they need to have a play here. And then we've got Microsoft. They've got the productivity graph. So that's in the enterprise, getting more done, maybe in the consumer space, getting more done, but that's not where they are positioned today. They've done a little bit of outreach on the consumer side, but they don't have a lot of uptake, in part because they're just not viewed that way. Consumers see them as a tool that they use in the office and not necessarily one that they use at home. Tier 3, a lot of people don't think about Samsung that much, but they're a player. If they were ever to be able to figure it out and to develop something that became widely popular, they would have instant global distribution. Because they're the #1 appliance manufacturer. They're either 1 or 2 in smartphone sales every year. They're big in tablets. They're a company that actually has huge position out there and a lot of assets. It's a question about whether they're going to be able to get Bixby, their voice assistant, to a place where the people are enthusiastic about it, but they could. The market's still early, and not a lot of loyalty has been established yet. People are actually trying all these different assistants. Then I'll throw IBM in there. And I think of them as like they create the custom graphs. So anybody who wants to work with voice, usually in the enterprise, they'll create something custom for you and focus on the back end. And so really what's happened is the battle lines have been formed. And largely what we see is a sorting. And that sorting is, at a gross level, is B2C versus B2B. And if you're not familiar with that, business to consumer versus business to business. Do I use this primarily at home, or do I use this primarily in my personal life? There's going to be very little crossover between those. There's a couple that might, like some of the new ones like Mycroft and Hound are sort of, they're heading over towards that business to business, but they have some B2C, so they could go either way. It's possible Google could be big in the enterprise, but because they have some assets there with G Suite, Gmail, that's really widely adopted, but harder to see that being a big push for them. Whereas you can see this natural sorting. Then there's other sorting. These are all the general plays, and then there's vertical plays underneath that. But today's talk, that's probably enough detail for everyone. So I hope that everyone learned a little bit today, and that you go check out voicebot.ai, sign up for the weekly newsletter, and check out the podcast, because I think you'll learn a lot.